Let's see. I usually pick a card, and I'm at my office today where I have many more choices. And I thought I'd pick a card today from these flower cards, just because it's new and different. So they're flower energy cards, and they're from the Alaskan Flower Essence site. So, if you picked a card from here, you could decide to get the flower essence that goes along with it and use that in your life. So that's up to you. But we'll see what flower is pulled for us today. And those that are better versed with flowers might have more insight than I'm probably going to have, but that's okay. So it was the full moon in Leo yesterday. For those that don't know, still kind of in the shadow of the full moon, which is the point of how we organize these Zooms. And today we're going to be talking about miscarriage and loss. Kind of a big topic. So just asking anybody that can turn on their video to please turn it on. It's so nice to see faces. And if you are able to take a moment, just a couple of moments to close your eyes, or I see some people are outside, which is really awesome. Just ground yourself on the earth. Just taking a couple breaths is all. Just to call yourself into your body here in these moments for this topic today, which can be full of a lot of emotion. And just noticing what feelings are coming up today. Noticing if your body has anything to tell you. Noticing your breath, and with noticing your breath, perhaps taking some intentional breaths into your womb space. So breathing deep down into your body. And noticing how when we breathe into our wombs, it often brings a sense of calmness and grounding. Just simple breath. So we're just noticing that, just getting ourselves situated for this topic. Feel free to open your eyes or kind of come back, and I will see what flower wants to appear for this talk today. Cool. So I'll show you the photo, and the back is where there are some words. So it's Lady's Slipper is the name of the plant, not one I'm familiar with. The key words are balance, circulation, energy, flow, focus, and regulate. And there are 2 affirmations. I focus and direct my healing energy with optimal results. And my energy system is vibrant, well-defined, and responsive to my needs. That feels relevant to me today with the topic of loss and healing and all that goes into losing a baby. So take it or leave it, but Lady's Slipper was that card. I thought it would be nice if anybody wanted to share, any or all of you wanted to share in the chat, just if you've had a pregnancy loss, if you've had a miscarriage, if you've had a stillbirth, or if you've supported women in this space. So either or, if you're open to sharing.
I was going to say the same thing.
We're on the same wavelength. If you haven't had this experience, then you're welcome to comment what you're wanting to learn today. Any or all are fine. Yeah, and thanks for sharing, of course. Maybe you'll feel too that this is a safe space for this kind of sharing, and also that miscarriage in particular is really common, and most women in their childbearing years will have some kind of experience in that realm, and not everybody feels supported or felt supported, and not everybody feels like they can even share or talk about it, right? So there's a lot of emotion and sometimes shame, and I'm sure things we'll get into around losing a baby. So thanks for sharing, everybody. I see that there are a lot.
And there's a couple comments about sort of what people are looking for, maybe in terms of topics today, just how to support people as a doula or with friends that are going through a pregnancy loss. And if there are other questions, definitely post them in the chat now or as they come up while we're talking. Otherwise, where should we start, Maren?
I wanted to share a little bit first about my experience as a student midwife, because I think it's pretty common. When I was a student midwife, an apprentice midwife, I don't feel like I was taught how to be with women with a miscarriage. And I think that's pretty common. So it doesn't mean women weren't having them in the practice that I worked with. I remember feeling kind of separate from that experience. So if a client did have a miscarriage, then maybe the midwife was involved. And that's a whole other topic, the extent to which midwives offer care, especially when they may not know someone, right? It may be before a first visit early in pregnancy. So to sum it up, I didn't see miscarriage support as a student, and that was really not an advantage to becoming a midwife. And I know Margot feels the same. It's really important that we are educated, even as doulas. You don't have to be a midwife to support a miscarriage. I mean, a woman, any woman that wants to really can provide the support for a miscarriage to a certain extent. So just saying that it's not often included in training. And for me, that left me feeling really scared by it because I hadn't had one myself at that point. So it was just like this really intimidating, like, oh man, I hope that never happens to me or happens to me as a midwife kind of feeling. So I really had to figure it out myself as a woman once I did have that experience. And then even as a midwife, figuring out how I would support women and what women needed, because I didn't know any of those things. I hadn't been taught any of them. So that's just sharing my own personal experience.
Something that I like to share often when we're talking about this topic, which comes up a lot at our skills workshops and like our midwifery skills workshops and our retreat answering the call to radical midwifery, is that I of course apprentice, well, maybe some of you don't know this, I apprenticed with Maren for about 5 years, and at the end of that time I also did a short-term placement at a high volume birth center. And it was really interesting for me to see how I went from, working with Maren and, actively supporting people through loss, and had 2 of my own, which perhaps we'll talk about, but to then going into this high volume practice where I really vividly remember a phone call I took kind of like on the street. I think I was out with my daughter and her dad, and we were doing some fun touristy kind of stuff. And I was on call, and I got the call from the birth center phone, which was like a separate phone, which is really funny. It was like an old phone. Anyways, and this woman was experiencing bleeding early in her pregnancy. It was a pretty clear, like, cramping, bleeding. She was probably having a miscarriage. And so part of the practice protocol was I answered the phone. I was the primary midwife, but I also patched in another midwife, and then to kind of oversee the call. And so she sort of took over this call in particular and just basically said, oh yeah, it sounds like you're having a miscarriage. Call us back when you get pregnant again. And that was that. It was really, really harsh. And that midwife had absolutely no idea how harsh that was. She was someone who had never even been pregnant, actually, herself, and definitely had no idea what it was like to be the woman on the other side of that phone, basically saying like, oh, sorry, that sucks, and call us again. And so I left that phone call. I mean, and there were so many things about that apprenticeship experience that were similar, that felt similarly not compassionate, but that's how most midwives are approaching the miscarriage. They don't see it as within their scope or realm. And I think part of it is a lot of them are really uncomfortable with serving women on the emotional and spiritual levels. So that is pretty typical. I know, it's so sad.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more about how you support people, or any stories that come to mind, Mirren? Since I think that could be a nice, hopeful place to take it. Story.
Right. Well, obvious miscarriage does happen. And last year in my practice, I definitely felt like there were more than I had ever supported before. And let's see, there was one I supported about a year ago, and actually she wasn't a client. She wasn't in my practice. She was a friend that I had met here. And her experience going through the medical world, as many of us would guess or know, was really awful. Similar to the story Margot shared, they just didn't care. It was like, we'll come in and we'll confirm. So this woman ended up calling me. She's like, oh, I don't know if this is appropriate. Like, I know you're a midwife. Like, is there any advice you could give me about this? And we talked through it, what was happening, how long it had been happening, how pregnant she thought she was. And, I think it is very practical advice to just say, you need to wait and see. And I know that's really hard, but that is what a lot of women choose, especially when they realize going into the medical system isn't going to save your baby. Like, that's the sad truth. There's nothing they can do. So if you're bleeding, if you're cramping, and otherwise, many women don't know that they can and should just stay home and get the support of a midwife or a doula, or at the very least, have a partner nearby if they need anything. But that it is something women do, that we have always dealt with death as women, and midwives as well. Midwives have always walked with women on this other side. So anyway, back to that story, she wound up being super grateful that she didn't go into the cold, yucky office to confirm something she already knew. And she wasn't the kind of lady that wanted follow-up. She didn't want blood work, she just felt like this happens and it's sad, but there was nothing anybody could have really done for her. So she really appreciated the support. We have since become very close friends, actually, and she's been trying to get pregnant again. And I feel like that experience alone will probably turn her towards home birth and midwifery, because she just didn't know. She just had no idea that there was that kind of support available. And yeah, that included emotional support, obviously, and just talking with people, just following up with them. That's all. Just texting them with how are you, and knowing how that can look and feel yourself is valuable. If my miscarriages taught me anything, and they taught me a lot, It's that there is kind of a flow often, and everybody's different and grief is different, but also there are sort of key points to check in. And mostly those are when everybody else forgets, which is very soon after. Women can have a loss, not even an early loss, like a real formed baby, whether that's a late miscarriage or a stillbirth. And sadly, the support really falls away quickly. I don't know if it's because people are uncomfortable, they just don't know what to say after a certain point. There's all kinds of ways to think about it. But the bottom line is that woman that lost a baby, once the miscarriage is complete, even some women think like, okay, I guess I'll go back to work. I guess I'll get back to life. And so there are lots of discussions to support them around those things, treating the time like a postpartum, taking care of your body, and leaving plenty of time to grieve and feel as you need to, because there's no right way to do it. And people that say, oh, it was just an early miscarriage. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when it is. If we lose a baby, we lose a baby. And, it takes the time it takes to, I don't even want to say get over it. Sometimes we don't get over it, but just to move through that experience.
Yeah, I think a point that you touched on that's worth exploring more here in this context with now 46 people on, which is awesome. Plus whoever's watching over on YouTube, of course, is just this over medicalization of miscarriage. And Valerie said over in the chat, we home birthed and our miscarriages were no different. And I think that in a lot of ways, miscarriage is even more feared than full-term birth in some ways. And there have been people that I've worked with who are considering home birth and have in their history, that they have had miscarriages, and we talk through it. And almost everyone that I've talked with, I'd say the vast majority of women that I've talked with here in Duluth who have had miscarriages have been somehow talked into getting a D&C instead of waiting for the process to happen on its own. And part of that is also just like a cultural disrespect for natural timing, and this focus on, like you were saying, Mary, like getting back to life, not wanting to wait. And I feel like you're someone who has such a unique experience. I don't know if you wanted to like get into that, but of waiting, and not just waiting a little while, like waiting a long time for the process to happen, and not rushing it and acting like it's a medical procedure that needs to just like get taken care of. And I've seen, for some of the women that I've talked with, they still feel like that was maybe the right choice, but a lot of them do feel like in retrospect it was rushed. And again, that there was that sort of like internal impatience and external impatience with like, this process that can be sort of unpredictable. I saw a few people over in the chat mention, or at least one mention, that they had a baby that died or stopped growing, at 8-ish weeks, but maybe they weren't birthed for a few more weeks, what we would call a missed miscarriage, which is a misnomer because that's more common than not. And so it's really a normal miscarriage. The ones that happen, the same day a baby dies are actually the aberration. But where was I going with that? Other than to say, oh, like unlike full-term birth, where, we have a range where it typically happens between, 38 and 42 weeks, which is still a big range. Like people can have a miscarriage and not birth the baby for a long time. And so there's almost more mystery and less we understand. And subsequently then have this very reactionary cultural tendency to be like, well, then we should just surgically get the baby out, without regard for the emotional, spiritual, and physical impacts that has on that woman and her process.
Fear of death, which is ironic in a way when it's already happened.
Right. It's just like this extreme discomfort.
Yeah, fear of having to deal with death. So again, I'm admitting that when I was a new midwife, I felt that way. It was like, oh boy, how will I be in that space? And like I said, when I later had a couple early miscarriages and then a later miscarriage, which I can share about, I realized what it felt like what it actually feels like to hold death. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, of course, but also there's such an opportunity for growth in that process if we allow the timing, as Margot has shared. So many women, early miscarriage, late, doesn't matter, whatever. Again, it's not always even the doctor's office. It's these women sometimes saying like, I want this to be over. Like, I want to go get this procedure because this is too uncomfortable. I know that this baby isn't alive anymore. And how do I live like that? You know, that's the question. How do I live like that? And yeah, Nicole, I was one of those women too. And I never expected to experience that. I mean, I guess, do you ever expect to experience something like that? But my story, and you can read more in our Indie Birth book, and there's blog posts, and there's at least one podcast I have about reading from his journal. So my son's name is Sable, and he died when I was about, I want to say 14-ish weeks pregnant. And I had dreams that he would die. I had felt those dreams more intensely than a normal dream. So there was that knowing, but also, you know, you hope you're wrong. You hope for sure you're wrong. And actually the way it started, it started with some bleeding, and I right away listened for his heartbeat because, you know, I had kind of known this would happen, and he had a heartbeat. That was mysterious. And then it seems like he went on to not have a heartbeat a couple days later. But anyway, it was kind of a crazy, like, is this happening? Is this not happening? What is happening? And then once it was confirmed, and that was by me, I actually didn't go to get an ultrasound. You know, I had a Doppler at home and there was no heartbeat. And, you know, I think as a mother, even when you don't want to face something like that, there is a knowing. And that's something I've learned over time supporting women, is that they do know. And it doesn't mean they want to talk about it. You know, it doesn't mean that it's in their conscious minds, but there's something that connects us, of course, to these babies, even if they only stay a short time. So the short version is that he died in November 16th is what I remember. And then he did not emerge from my body until March, and actually a month from today, March 6th. So it was 4 months-ish, right? Remember December? I can't even count. It was a long time. It was many, many weeks. And like I said, I recount some of what I experienced in that one podcast. It's called Readings from His Journal, because I kept like, I don't know how many journals I filled during that 4 months. And, you know, it was filled with every emotion. So yes, this is sad. Yes, this is hard to hear. You know, yes, it was hard to be that person and hold this baby inside my body. But actually, there were so many emotions and different things that came up during the process. Sometimes it was just ridiculous. I was like, is this really my life? And it was kind of funny almost, like, here I am just living my life. Like, I was still attending births as a midwife, and my clients knew what was happening. You know, Margot was there and like at the ready for whenever this would happen. And it just didn't. Like, I had bleeding and I had cramping and I had, oh, it's going to be tonight. And it just wasn't for many, many months. So it was an extended story of holding death within. But his birth, when it finally happened, was really beautiful and really easy. And, you know, I was so glad I hadn't rushed it more than I did. I'm so glad I got that time. And I don't feel traumatized because my power wasn't ever taken from me. It was all dictated by myself. and what this soul wanted and needed. So even though it was sad, I wasn't traumatized. And so, yeah, there are some links there that Margot has posted. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'll add them later to the YouTube video.
You can also do a good old-fashioned Google if you're feeling like you want them sooner, and just do indie birth, miscarriage, and loss, and we have a whole like category for all of those links, and most of them should be on that page.
And because of that, this is probably obvious too. I feel like I'm the person a lot of people come to with that similar situation. And not to freak anyone out, but it's actually a fairly common situation. It just isn't one that I had ever encountered. And, I think we have this myth in our culture that once you get past the first trimester, that doesn't happen. And it's true. It's not as common, but it's also not completely uncommon. I've met so many women over the years since then that have had a similar situation. And it's like the body just doesn't quite, I don't know, like almost like doesn't register what has happened, was sort of my theory.
And I know you kind of said this, but if you haven't already checked out our book, Indie Birth, A Story of Radical Birth Love, I'll put the link here too, but it's indiebirth.org/book. And I think we have it on there for pay what you can, right? Like it's just donation based. Is that right, Maren? Am I remembering?
I believe so. I mean, unless you order a hard copy on Amazon, which you're welcome to. I'm somebody that likes hard copies, so either is fine.
Yeah. One of the biggest pieces of feedback we've gotten on that is that the miscarriage stories that are in that book in full are really, really meaningful to people. And I think it's a really great book to have in your library if you're a birth worker, if you just know a lot of women who are in that stage of life and want to loan it out. Obviously, we talk about all kinds of really cool stuff and autonomy and freedom and great birth stories, and there's photos. But yeah, that's one of the most common things we hear when we get feedback about the book, is that the sections on loss are maybe the most impactful for a lot of people. Gabby had a question, Maren. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I'll read it. Gabby says, thank you for sharing your story. Even if baby has no heartbeat, the body starts the birth on its own. Yes, ideally. So even with an early loss, eventually the body catches up. So I think it's about 6 weeks on average. Again, if it's really early, if it's like a 5-week miscarriage, then obviously it hasn't been 6 weeks. Like sometimes, if something didn't go right in the process, the body knows pretty quickly into a pregnancy. And actually, I feel like that's a blessing in a lot of ways. You're not waiting around. It just kind of happens. But if it's later in pregnancy, maybe it's 12 weeks, maybe it's 14, that it's at least 6 weeks sometimes until the body kind of like figures it out and then births the baby. But like I said, in my case, it wasn't 6 weeks. It was much longer than that. And as I was in the middle of it, believe me, I was researching every day. I was talking to elder midwives every day. And what I realized is the 6 weeks doesn't really mean anything when most women are going to do something about it, right? So it's like it throws the statistics, because most women nowadays don't wait however long it takes. They're scared into it. And one of my questions was then, and even now when I support women in a similar situation, is like, what's the fear, right? So I see a comment from Paige about infections, and that's what I was told, right? That's what the books say. Oh, well, you'll get an infection. And my experience was not that at all. I took really good care of myself. I was taking immune support every day. I was eating really well. And since then, I've pondered it more, and it doesn't really make sense. So if you have a closed environment, right, a baby grows in an amniotic sac, there's fluid in there, there's a placenta perhaps. If the waters aren't open, what's causing the infection that everybody's so scared of? It doesn't really make any sense. So if I'm counseling someone, of course, if they start to not feel well, if they get a fever, if they have signs of infection, sure, maybe that means something. But I certainly had none. And I probably could have gone even longer because it was a closed environment. How was a germ supposed to get in? So yeah, it doesn't mean people don't get infections. My guess is that in a lot of those cases, they're having stuff stuck in there, though. They're having ultrasound probes stuck in there, or hands, or, they get an infection after a D&C, for example. So that was something I learned, that that's not a reason to go do something. I mean, you can, but you might as well wait and see and take care of yourself and not expect that. It's really an odd thing the medical world has posed for us, as if our baby that isn't alive somehow becomes, toxic. It's not true.
Mm.
It's a really great way to scare people, though. And I've heard so many women say that, like, oh, they said I need a D&C because I'm going to get an infection. It's like, well, then wait and see if you do. I mean, why would you? Anyway, it's just one of those myths. I think that makes miscarriage even more mysterious and sort of grosser in a way, like the medical world wants us to think that's just gross. Like if you have a dead baby and you just get it out, like there's no honoring that. There's no sitting with that. There's no learning from that. So checking ourselves where we feel some of those things too, that perhaps we've taken on from that system that really doesn't understand a woman and her ways.
Is there anthropological info on history of miscarriage management throughout the world? Fun question, Erin. I have not come across it. If there is, I'm sure someone out there has studied it, but that might be a fun thing to create if that's something you're interested in.
I read all kinds of stories when I was in it, and I'm not saying they're from around the world. I don't know where they were from, but as far as like what did women used to do, right? There were a lot of stories, even really crazy cool ones. Like one I remember that really stuck with me. And actually, a midwife friend had seen this in her practice. So this isn't like only an old timey thing. So the story is the woman had a miscarriage similar to mine, and the body didn't expel the baby ever. And the woman got back to cycling and got pregnant and had a baby. And then when she had her live full-term baby, they also were able to see the baby that had been left in there. So yeah, I know a midwife who supported someone like that. And those were some of the stories. Like, okay, if we don't remove what's in there, like what does nature do? And it seems like that's not entirely weird if the body can figure out cycling again, which, I'm not saying that's common. I'm just saying we don't know all the possibilities of how this used to look because there's so much intervention. But I found a lot of peace in that story at the time, actually, because it just was so wild. And I could feel my spirit baby Deva hovering. And I was like, well, maybe that's how she'll get in. Maybe they'll just be in there together and it'll be this wild, crazy thing. But no, she waited for him to get out.
Lean asks, is there a text on the physiological miscarriage processes and management? I know, I mean, Anne Fry talks about it in her books, but not a ton. I remember reading those chapters when I was thinking I was having my first miscarriage. I had read them already, but I think that's in volume 1, right, Maren? I don't think she has anything in volume 2 about it. Like that's all just full term
Right.
birth. And she had something interesting in volume 1 about how often with first trimester miscarriage, the placenta will come later, like sometimes 24 hours later, even after the baby is birthed. And that was my experience for sure the first time, and to a lesser degree the second time that I had a miscarriage. And it was so helpful to know that. And I feel like having, like, just that's like a great tidbit to plant in the back of your brain if you know somebody who's going through this, because yeah, I won't rehash the whole story, but even knowing that was the case, I guess there's this other piece too, right? So a lot of people are told that their miscarriage in the first trimester is going to be like a heavy period, which is not true. It's just like, if that's true for someone, that it's pretty uncommon. Most of the time it's more like a labor process. And sorry, I'm getting distracted by the other question over here. I won't read it while I'm trying to talk. I should close the chat box when I'm talking. I get like a goldfish. So it's typically more like an actual labor process. And usually the sac with the baby comes out first. And right. So, but a lot of women are told it's gonna be like a heavy period. Most of them don't even try to see what has come out. They just pass it into the toilet and they flush it. So that's sort of a different scenario than I'm talking about. But if you're working with someone or talking with someone or supporting a friend who's going through a loss, who wants to be like more involved and participating more in the process, one recommendation that's really simple is to like put a strainer underneath the toilet seat so that it catches any clots or tissue that comes out so they can look at it. I personally just kind of like squatted over a bowl both times for the most part, and in that way could see what was coming out. And then knowing what I know about birth and babies and fetal development, I was able to figure out what was going on, what I was seeing. Someone who maybe doesn't have that experience might want to like phone a friend, phone a midwife, send pictures to a midwife to get their 2 cents. But again, typically the baby comes out in the sac. Usually the waters don't break, right? So like the baby's in the sac with fluid typically. If the baby's visible, they're visible. And if they're too early on to be visible, then you don't see them. And then the placenta usually comes out separately and looks like a tiny placenta, depending on the gestational age at which the baby died. So anyways, long story short, even knowing that that was the case and knowing that the placenta might not come out right away, I think I went out of the house like 24 hours after passing the baby and was like having these terrible cramps and like something felt stuck in my cervix. And I got home and like took another bath, and sure enough, the placenta was like wedged in my cervix, and I like kind of got it out myself. And so that was a really, and I talk about that in the book, but it was a good reminder of like, oh, you can't rush the process. I thought the process was over. It wasn't over. And a lot of women that I talk to and support through that experience, I maybe don't relay the whole like detailed version of my story, but I just make sure they understand like more stuff might come out. Like, please do not go to Target and like pretend life is normal. Like, it's not, even if it's just physically, right? Like, not even considering the emotional grief part of it all. Even if it's just physically, like, please stay home and rest. And expect that there might be more clots, there might be placenta, there might be, who knows, mystery tissue. But where was I going with any of that? Did I have a point other than just those are some some tips to keep in mind? Oh yeah, the question about, is there a text? The other really great resource out there is Molly Dutton Kenny. I'll put her name over here. She has a blog with really thorough resources on miscarriage, what to expect, using Cytotech to induce miscarriage at home, that sort of thing. And then Aviva Ram has a complete guide to miscarriage at home, I believe. And then I think one of our students also made one that I'll try and find a link for. I see that there's like a 3-part series, so I'll post the link for maybe part 3, and then you can backtrack to 1 and 2. But this is from one of our alumni, Casey, who's a midwife in Utah. I'm adding those to this list, Maren.
Okay. To get to Nico's question, she's asking about pregnancy after a miscarriage or loss and just how it can be different. I have a podcast on that somewhere. I think it's called that, maybe Pregnancy After Loss. And I didn't do that podcast until my baby after Sable, Dava, was born, because honestly, it was like too much emotionally to think about while I was in it. So yes, I feel like that's definitely a thing. I don't know that the support looks a whole lot different other than just being present and being aware of the story and being there, right? Because there's nothing, the hardest part about it when we get pregnant again is that there are not any guarantees in life. And we know this really well. And support and love is really awesome. But at the same time, there's no one that can tell you this is all going to be fine, right? Like, that's just not the way life works. So being present to someone that's had a loss and recognizing, if you're the midwife, if you're the doula, that it's not uncommon for other emotional stuff to crop up, and that's a simple way of saying it because it's really unique for someone. So I know for me, like, I had a ton of like preterm contractions when I was pregnant with Dava, and she was born a term, but it was like my uterus just having an emotional response, I think, to getting to that point in pregnancy and like having fears. And, so I think our bodies can sometimes do interesting things after loss. And of course, different fears might pop up. Lack of connection to the baby is something I've seen at least for a good long time, and women just being honest about it, right? Like, I don't know if I want to connect yet to this baby. Like, I'm not sure what will happen here. So again, there's no magic fix, of course. I know you're not asking for that, but it's just being present for the story and being present for the ways that that experience will weave into. And that's how I like to talk about it, right? With all of my kids, all of their birth stories, the miscarriages, like, it's like a giant tapestry, and they all weave together and they all have parts in common. And this one affected this one. And, and of course, there's the mystery of all of that, like how all these spirit babies are in the ethers together and what that means for us as their mothers, because we'll always be their mothers, whether they're here or not. So they're really beautiful conversations, I think. And I'm really grateful for the experiences I've had that make me not afraid to have those conversations. Because I can see how, it might be intimidating or whatever, you're not quite sure how to sit with someone that's had something really big happen. But it's usually just a matter of, like I said, being present for it. Yeah. And as Valerie's saying, trusting in the design. While we can't guarantee someone a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby, like most will be, right? So where are we going to put our focus and what can we control? Because we can't control death. But there are things in a pregnancy that we can feel more confident about doing and affecting the outcome. So sometimes it's just helping someone see their perspective and change their perspective. And, not to mention all of like the deeper spiritual work. And if you believe in soul contracts and right, there's so many ways to talk about loss and the way it looks in our lives. And I know for me, that's been really helpful as well. For me, I believe it isn't an accident, that it was all meant to be the way it was. And that was the contract I had with this soul, even though maybe it wasn't what I would have chosen. So, not forcing those beliefs on anyone when I'm supporting them, but often women come to those kind of conclusions eventually, that they're sad, but they start to see the perfection in life, right? Because this is life.
Well said. I wonder what other questions or topics people are curious about. Khadija, if you want to just throw out a question or a topic, and if it's something we already talked about, we will tell you that, and you can totally watch the recording. But if it's something we haven't, then we can totally answer it. So ask away. I think we could sum that up pretty quickly. Just the, ways that you support women in law, services you offer. Something we didn't really mention, but I think, thank you for asking that. Marion mentioned like lots of follow-up support after by text, and like, supporting people beforehand by text too, or calling and talking through what's going on, sitting in that unknown time, or talking through their options. And sometimes that looks like being a second opinion, especially if someone's already been to the hospital or been to the clinic and been presented their clinical, like, super medical options. Sometimes talking about the less medical options, which include things like waiting, right? But I also have, and you have too, Marin, right? Like, been with someone while they were actively in the miscarriage process. And I think that's something that's pretty unique. I remember, I think it was between it might have been after, I'm trying to remember the timeline, but I remember going to someone's house that was a client of yours, Marin, who was like in the miscarriage process, but she was alone with her 2 kids. And I think it was after I had had a miscarriage myself, but maybe it wasn't. And it looked like hanging out with her and watching New Girl on her couch, and like laughing and crying and eating snacks and being like, fucking A, this sucks. And when the baby came out, she like brought it out for me to look and make sure that that's what it was, and that it seemed like everything was there that should be. And then make her some food and tuck her in and check on her the next day. So I've also been with people during later miscarriages, and I guess a mix of earlier and later losses. And there are definitely like clinical things to be watchful for, particularly blood loss. So that's something we talk about with our students, but it's essentially the same skill set that you would need if you were managing a postpartum hemorrhage. So I think that that's something that should be normalized, actually having someone come be present during maybe a long process or a particularly challenging one, or just one where someone really needs that support or they're alone. So just wanted to put that out there as a thing. But that's hard to really do, especially if someone's, brand new, doesn't even realize what midwifery is. Home birth is maybe a new concept. Like, the idea that someone would come sit with them while they're having a miscarriage is like not in their consciousness as a possibility. So it's something that we need to talk about with our communities.
I know for a lot of the miscarriages I've supported, I've actually not been there, and I've been willing to be there. But I think that's another way it can look, is that most of the time you don't quite know when it's going to happen, especially if you haven't experienced this before. So you can have spotting for days to weeks. So, to be present isn't always practical. But as long as women know what to watch for, and that they can call and they can send photos and all of that, it's worked out fine in my experience. And sometimes it's not till after the fact, like they just kind of get in it, and then you hear from them later saying, oh, it's over, it happened. Like, that's happened a whole lot of times. So you can be more supportive on the other side then.
There was a question about supporting women whose babies have died during the birth process, which I feel like we could talk about, but is maybe like an enormous conversation, and perhaps could be like a whole separate day. separate circle. I don't know. What do you think, Marion?
Right. I don't know that there's enough time to really give that its due.
That's, yeah.
As far as miscarriage reasons, there's a million, I'm sure, and everybody has their own history and all of that. So my general feeling is that miscarriage is really normal. And if someone finds themselves, in a situation where they don't think it is, or maybe they've had a lot of them or whatever, then sure, there are things you could investigate. But on average, again, like I said, starting the meeting, if most women in their reproductive life will have a loss, then I think my assumption is that something wasn't quite right in the process, whether it's genetically or implantation or whatever. And that's where maybe the guilt and shame comes in sometimes, because it's easy to think in a lot of cases, maybe that you did something. And, to that end, I'll share a quick story. I had a client. Well, she ended up not being a client, to be honest. I worked with her a little in the beginning, but the reason she contacted me initially was she had just found out she was pregnant, and she had done lots of cocaine and was worried about what would happen. Now, I couldn't tell her what would happen. All I could say was, you have to wait and see. The one thing she had going for her, if you read like fetal development stuff, is that it had happened before she even knew she was pregnant. So less risk perhaps at that point. Like at that point, we're taught, at least in the books, that the body will just, get rid of the baby if something went horribly wrong, or if it didn't, it will continue to grow. So long story short, she was kind of a mess mentally and emotionally for a long time. And the short version is she had, I believe, a really nice home birth with a full-term baby. So anyway, not that, not that there aren't things we can do, I guess, that somebody would feel guilty about, because she did feel very guilty, even though she didn't harm her baby. So I'm saying that to say, women do all kinds of things before they even know they're pregnant, and a healthy pregnancy will persevere. I've had other women who found out they were pregnant, didn't want to be, took a shitload of herbs, did all kinds of stuff to themselves, bled even, and went on to have a full-term healthy baby. So nature is resilient. And when it doesn't quite work out, I do not believe, we are not at fault as women. We're just the vessel. We're the vessel. And nature is imperfect in those ways, right? Not everything is meant to survive. So, yeah, those are some anecdotes there.
Like this one is kind of a last wrap-up question as we approach noon here. This, have you talked support for self as the birth worker?
I don't think we really hit on that. I feel like the work we do all of the time is the work we do all of the time. So, like these are life topics. These are life topics. We just live in a culture that avoids acting like this is part of our human experience. So dwelling on death, maybe not so healthy, but having this healthy appreciation for what we can control and what we can't. It grounds me into my own self, because just as I don't believe a woman is at fault if her baby dies, 99.9% of the time, no one's at fault. Like, this is just sometimes what happens. So getting clear on our own role in the universe, right? Our own spirituality, our own relationship to God, or whoever you call the higher power, like that's the support I think I rely on. Because I'm just here doing this work. I don't control any of it.
Yeah, just ditto that, the self-care that we think is crucial for birth workers to be doing anyways is what you need. Um, and sort of along the lines of this other question about, babies that die at full term or in labor, that was sort of too big for today. That's the only experience that I've had as a midwife. That, I guess what I'm saying is, like, I have not felt like I needed anything like super extra in terms of dealing with miscarriage and later losses, other than, it's sad, and I feel sad alongside my friends and women that I love. But the experience of a still full-term stillbirth has been the hardest for me as a midwife, and is a thing for sure.
Yeah, that feels like a great start to this topic. An hour isn't really nearly enough, just enough to share some stories with you all and hear where you're at. So I don't know what the plan is to go deeper with this, but we're always willing to, especially on these new moon and full moon Zooms. I think we have a couple more topics planned out, maybe for 2 more, but then we're kind of open and we'll be planning those. So if you have a topic you'd love to hear on these calls, you can always email us at support@indiebirth.org. And we're happy to see kind of where people are at.
Maybe a plug for the new program, since that might tie in with this topic. It's probably something we will be touching on.
Yeah, maybe you can place the link there. But Margot and I are starting a new program for practicing midwives. And it doesn't matter if you've been practicing for 30 years or 3 months, whatever. It's called Elevate, and it's going to be a 6-week kind of deep dive into our role as midwives and how we can honor this as a soul calling even more. Even practicing midwives who've been doing this a long time, right? It's easy sometimes to get caught in just like the system of all of it and the things that burn us out, and all of the negatives in a sense that keep us just doing things at sort of an average level. And so with this program, we really want to help you figure out ways that this can look so exciting and so creative and so fun, and you can feel even more connected to the women you're serving, and just have it really be a soul calling in every way possible. So you can sign up to learn more, and registration for that will open March 1st. And we will start around spring equinox. So a couple weeks to kind of learn about it and figure out if it's for you.
And if you're not a midwife, but you're on this call and you know a midwife, or you're a doula and you work with lots of midwives, we would be so appreciative if you would copy that link and send it to them and say, hey, this is a thing I heard about. It looks really cool. That would mean so much to us. And word of mouth is way better than paying the terrible Facebook overlords. So please help us out that way, because we're not advertising this program, at least at the moment, in that way. So we would so appreciate you taking like 30 seconds to copy paste it into a quick email and send it to all your midwife friends.
Yeah. And last but not least about that, I mean, the hope is it'll be a beautiful community. So we'll be meeting like this, and we'll have time for all of us to share stories and questions. So it's not just like a bunch of lectures. It's really creating a community for midwives that we hear is long overdue. So we'll see. We'll see if that's true.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Happy full moon again, when we'll see you at the new moon. I have no idea what the topic is as of now, so you'll have to watch for alerts.
A mystery.
In about 2 weeks.